You're listening to another episode of Rally DNA.
Well, thanks very much for joining us, everyone. This week we have none other than Ryan Champion as our special guest for the Rally DNA podcast. Thanks very much for joining us, Ryan.
That's nice to be here. Thanks for asking me.
Welcome along.
Thank you.
So, going back to the beginning, am I right in saying that it sounded like you didn't really have much of a chance in terms of being petrol obsessed from a young age? Am I right in saying that both your mum and your dad were rally drivers and co-drivers?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I was dragged. Well, I don't know if I had to be dragged along to rallies. In fairness, I mean, I think it was pretty much in the blood from an early age. But I remember the first vague memory I have, honestly, is as a 5-year-old. But my family were Talbot dealers, like literally, like the garage was 20 meters away from here, and Talbot actually serviced in the workshop that year, and of course it was the year that Toivonen won the RAC 1980 in the Lotus Sunbeam, and I was 5, so it doesn't take a lot of working out how old I am now. But and funnily enough, I remember, because they were around for a while, they were around setting up, and I remember Avenger Estates. They had some Avenger Estates that they were using for service, and I think some of them might have even been Lotus engine. My dad subsequently told me, but so I vaguely remember the Talbot team been here that year, and then Dad did a little bit in the 70s, but I was quite young at the time, so I really grew up. He stopped competing, and he got my mum into co-driving for him at that point. And when he stopped competing himself, Mum carried on co-driving. So I grew up around Mum going rallying. It was just normal to get dragged off to South Wales again, to do a national championship rally or whatever it was. And obviously living in North Yorkshire, and it can take quite a while to get to South Wales now, as I go to Walters Arena quite regularly, but it seems to take an awful long time then in the back of whatever car it was at the time. But my weekends were usually spent following Mum around the country, and that included Mum doing the RAC. She did Ypres, she did Belgian, French events, and inherently it was something that I always wanted to get into. But that pretty much meant that I got into co-driving first, because not only was she co-driving, but it meant I don't really remember, but whatever it was, 12, certainly by 14, because I was already doing 12 car rallies by then. I was stuck in a chase car or service van or whatever, and given a load of maps, because you used to have to use maps back then. Told to get the service vehicle or the chase car or whatever it was to wherever it was going. Did a few 12-car rallies co-driving, then moved on to stage rallies co-driving before I ever got behind the wheel on a stage rally.
As Jamie said, you probably didn't have much of a chance, but was there a moment you could put your finger on? You said, I want to actually be part of this and do this going forward? Because obviously you were going to have a love of the sport growing up like that, but was there a particular thing that you could put your finger on then that led to say, yes, this is me now, I'm doing this, that's it?
The one memory I have, funny enough, is someone did the RAC in, I think it would be 91. I think it was 91, and it finished in Harrogate, so it was relatively local. And it was in the days where they put the winning car on stage, and Uar Kankinen drove the winning Integrale on stage in the exhibition hall or whatever it was. And they played the Finnish national anthem, and he drives on and he hops out the car, and I'm just like, I want to do that. Like, funny enough, it wasn't even a stage memory, if you like. I just remember that, like the whole Finnish celebration and him driving on stage at the prize giving. I just thought, how cool is that? And but then, funnily enough, we were eating lunch so it must have, whatever day it finished, can't remember the format, but it was something like I'm going to say Thursday morning or something, a prize giving. And we were having lunch over the road afterwards, and in walks UR Kankinen. And at the time, my dad had just bought me what subsequently I learned was a McLean calendar. It was the first McLean calendar I'd ever had. And of course, there was a couple of pictures of Kankinen in it. And, I was always really shy. So I can't actually believe I would have gone across and asked him. I don't know how it happened. But anyway, next thing, Kankinen signed these couple of pictures for me. So that whole experience I remember and just thought, it was definitely in the blood by that point.
I can imagine Juha was a good person to pick as a first sort of WRC celebrity to speak to as well. I think he was one of my first when I must have been about 10 or so at a Silverstone rally sprint. And I had an old issue of Rally Sport with me with, I think it was the top 10, can't have been Finnish rally drivers, but certainly the top 10 rally drivers that they thought at the time. And Juha signed it and then made sure to extend his signature all the way over Tommy and various other fellow Finns photos, just to sort of like just still have somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, he was quite a character, wasn't he? Like you just look back at the interviews, and obviously there's a famous one about what tyres are on Juha, black round Pirellis. He had a very dry sense of humour during his career, and I mean, there was a lot of drivers. I mean, my heroes growing up would have been more Tony Pond and Henry Toivonen from the Sunbeam days. Tony Pond, because we were Austin Rover dealers, and we used to get, well, same with Talbot, we used to get the posters and the stickers and everything else that you used to get in the day. But Kankinen was definitely, he was just such a cool character, wasn't he? And funnily enough, you mentioned the Silverstone Rally Sprint track. I actually went round the Silverstone Rally Sprint track with Kankinen in a Repsol Escort WRC.
Oh, wow.
And
that'd be 97 or so.
Yeah, I have the picture somewhere. There's a young-looking me sat alongside him. I'll dig it out and we'll take a picture of it and I'll send it to you or something to share it. So a 21-year-old me, I think it was, sat alongside Kankinen, and that was quite an experience just to sit alongside him as well.
That must have been pretty special, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, I've been lucky to sit with a few world champions now, but that was, he was definitely the first. I'd never sat in with a world champion, as it were. So when I say that, I'd never been in with Burnsy at that point, actually. No, he hadn't won the world championship at that point. So I hadn't been in with a world champion at that point. But I mean, and I always loved that. And I still love that now. I still love getting in a car with somebody good and just watching what they do with it, because it's never, normally you get in a car and it's not different to what any other driver does. It's just the sheer confidence. That's what you see with a good driver, just doing exactly what needs to be done at the right time. And that's what makes the difference. And he had different techniques and such like, and you can just learn so much by sitting in with a good driver. I really enjoy that and find you can still pick up quite a lot just from sitting in with somebody who is not necessarily of that level, of a very good level. You can always pick stuff up.
We've touched on this already on your long drives to Walters or to South Wales, but I mean, I've always considered Yorkshire to be, certainly for England, the kind of one of rallying's homes. Would you have said that was a factor in your early career? Being from where you're from, was it helpful? As a home counties lad, for instance, there was Naffle Rally. Well, there we are.
So sat next to me is the Yorkshire Rally Mafia book that Jonathan Pollard just wrote recently. And yeah, I grew up around that, and Dad used to supply a lot of them tyres. Like sort of Yuck Hodgson, who's a local rallying legend, would have been friend of Dad's, and Yuck Speed, and Steve Bannister was a long-time customer of Dad's, and the other rallying legends locally, Piggy Thompson, who of course Craig Thorley, my co-driver, co-drove for Piggy when Craig was earlier on in his career, and so I grew up with these names. Andy Elliott, who still has a nightclub in York, funnily enough, and these were all like heroes of mine. And then subsequently Pete Slights, who Mum sat with, who again, there we go. I haven't organised these props, but there's Pete's Metro. And Chris Birkbeck, who Mum sat with as well, who, they were all local very good local drivers at the time. And so, yeah, absolutely, because you had rallies on the, one thing that we struggle for with rallying is it's always tucked away, isn't it? That's the problem, and that's why we always struggle. Certainly in on the mainland, the UK anyway, they're always tucked away, and it struggles to capture the imagination of the local area. But I mean, Cropton Forest is like, probably as a crow flies, like 6 miles that way. Back in the day, there was Gisborough Forest, Ingleby Forest, all around here that we used, and so you never had to go far to go and see rally cars. And of course, at that time, they were probably used half a dozen times a year.
It's a big part of it, isn't it? I mean, we've touched on this with other guests. I suppose, notably talking to Alex Gelsomino lately, talking about rallying in the States. The place is just so vast, and trying to grow the sport in a country like that, especially with, a relatively, even though the championships has many rounds, the country's so damn big. It's hard, as a fan, you can't hit multiple events, and they're quite off the beaten track.
Yeah, particularly in the States, like you said, the spread's so far apart. But like I said, I think even in whether it's England, Scotland, and Wales, we've struggled with that over the years. A closed road rally inherently can start from the centre of town, and the stages can start pretty close by. Whereas a forest rally, that's rarely the case, and you still have to make the effort to get into a forest because nobody lives on a forest road, or very few people, and so it's always just been tucked away, and it was very different. Obviously, I mean, we all know we all sit there and watch YouTube, all the videos of the whatever area you like to pick, but at the time there was probably 3 channels on TV when rallying was big. And people were willing to spend, a couple of hours or a few hours in the car to go and see this exciting sport. Whereas nowadays people just want everything instantly, don't they? And people aren't going to get in the car and drive for 4 or 5 hours just to see a car for 20 seconds if you're lucky.
That's a very good point about the 3-4 channels thing as well. And especially being that, for most of this time rallying was on grandstand. So, quite a high profile, shop window for the time, and unbroken by adverts, 2 hours or so of top quality coverage. Yeah,
massively so. And again, you're on about what sparked my interest. I had all those all those rallies on video. Dad was recording them for me, and I would just play them over and over and again, particularly Toivenen's RAC win. God, I don't know how many times I watched that, and it, like Murray Walker doing the BBC coverage at the time, and then Dickie Davis, as it was, presented the World of Sport coverage, and that's what I grew up on.
I still get the odd shock actually watching some of those old ones, and Murray Walker comes on. I keep forgetting that he did some of those.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And the rallycross as well. He did rallycross as well as the circuit race and the Grand Prix.
Yeah. That footage of Murray Walker commentating on Martin Shanky getting outside a 6R4 and waving his fist at, I think it's Will Gollop, is still one of Murray's finest moments out of a massive roster.
And there's a pretty good one of him commentating on the Escadavid Rally Sprint. I'm going to take a stab. Somebody will point me right, but I'm going to say 1979. Malcolm Wilson in the Total Escort, and he says he's the young up-and-coming rally star. Watch this, and then he promptly rolls on the next corner.
Commentator's curse personified. Yeah,
he was good at that, wasn't he, Murray Walker?
Yeah, he had a few of those moments. So your first involvement as a driver, then you got involved in the Maestro on a few occasions.
Yeah, well, just 2 occasions, but it was Dad. So, like I already mentioned, we were Austin Rover dealers at the time, and Dad had been rallying an Escort. And my grandfather decided it would be better if he drove something that the family business actually sold, and so his Group 4 BDA was sold to buy a Maestro. So it was a brand new Maestro. I remember we picked it up during the '85 RAC because Mum was away doing the rally, and I'd been allowed to go at the start of the rally on the Sunday. And then Dad and I picked this brand new Maestro up on the, I don't know, whatever it was, let's say the Tuesday or Wednesday night from the main dealer in Scarborough. And then it went down to Silverstone to be prepared. And Dad did like, I don't know, 4 years in the Maestro Challenge. And albeit the car wasn't the most exciting, the championship was pretty good. People forget that we just mentioned Malcolm Wilson, Tony Pond, David Llewellyn, even the likes of Damon Hill, Gary Brabham, they all drove the celebrity car because it was an Austin Rover supporter championship. And they did races, they did rallies, they did hill climbs, sprints, and it was quite a social championship. But that had finished by the time, so I passed my driving test in 92, and the Maestro sat there. So it already been sat there probably for, I don't know, I guess a couple of years not doing anything. And so I did my first couple of rallies in it. Then used it as a recce car once I started on the Peugeot Challenge. I put it off in Belgium, recceing in 1994, and it sat untouched, I would say, for a long time anyway, until about 4 years ago when we resurrected it out of a corner, and it's now in pretty good shape again. Now it's one of the rare Maestros in quite good condition. It's 18,000 miles from new. Always raced or rallied. One owner, patchy service history.
Fantastic. And from there, you were presumably one of the earliest in the Peugeot Challenge. Would it be 93, the first year with the 205?
Yeah, I mean, actually, it'd been going a few years, I think, because it
was 309's earliest, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, a 309, they did the Young Lions, which was, I can't remember if it was 87 or 88, which Colin McRae was one of them.
Yeah. And
they ran them in the National Championship as a precursor to the first year of the Challenge, which I think was 89 from memory, but I could be wrong. And it was 205s and 309s. So yeah, by the time I did it in 93, it was very well established. And I did do one rally at the end of 92. I think maybe did a rally in Hampstead in the car, and then started 93. And there was like 60 odd Peugeots out on a round. And I remember finishing an early rally in, I don't know, let's say 37th Peugeot or something, and been fairly mortified, going, how do you do that? And then we sort of got into the I don't know, top 20 probably, and then you needed the Skip Brown engine at the time, it turns out. And once we got the Skip Brown engine, then suddenly the top 10s came, and finished my first year with a win in Belgium on the Tour of Flanders. And that was quite a highlight at the time. It was only my second ever tarmac rally, never done a pace note rally. But in those days, you could, you did practice, really. You hear a lot of talk of it in the All World Championship days, but even then, in the early 90s, in the Maestro, we went over and over the stages and did a really good recce, and come the rally, you really knew the stages pretty well. And in some ways, it was actually an easy way to make pace notes, because you got a chance to practice not only making pace notes, but refining your pace notes. Whereas obviously now, for people doing it off a 2-pass recce, it's quite a difficult skill to learn, actually. So where you had unlimited recce's back in the day, it was certainly much easier to do. And it's funny, it's something I still say to young drivers and co-drivers. Yes, you need to do them in 2 passes, but if you've never done them before, just go and practice on your local roads. Go and do 8 or 10 passes until you're comfortable in what that corner looks like in your head and what you call it. And then when you go and do a 2-pass recce, it's much easier if you've done more passes before that, because it's a massive part of the sport now. And I think sometimes people underestimate just how important it is.
And of course, it sounds like you were wrecking at quite a speed in the Maestro in Belgium as well. So,
I mean, speed and Maestro is comparative, obviously.
Yes,
but,
relative to the car.
But what you used to do, and then I went from Maestro to a 309 GTI, which was a little bit quicker, but I guess not that much quicker, really. But yeah, the recce's even then were pretty free. And what you used to do was make the notes in the daytime, and you were steady away in the daytime. You used to wait till it got dark. And then once it got dark, the spectators came out and they pretty much closed the junctions off. I remember particularly the first time I went to Le Touquet in France, and there would have been myself, Justin Dale, Jock Armstrong, Neil Simpson, Guy Anderson. We were all doing the 205 challenge together, and the recce was actually good fun, honestly, because you did carry a bit of speed in it, and at that time the Works Clios were out. There was Bugalski and Ragnotti. It was the first year of the 306s, I seem to think, and we worked out if you wrecked somewhere near Ragnotti, roads were closed. there was that many Ragnotti fans out, and he put a bit of a show on at every hairpin. So every junction was closed. If you could be wrecking the stage where Ragnotti was, you didn't need to worry about stopping for junctions.
It's the motorsport equivalent of following an ambulance closely to get through the lights.
It probably was, yeah. But there was regular story, and I mean, it's probably not good to talk about this now in today's politically correct world, but it was very rare that you got to the end of a recce without going off. Very rare.
Wow.
Halcyon days.
It was a bit really with hindsight, yeah.
And in '94, then you were the winner of the junior championship with the Peugeot.
Yeah, so '94, obviously 93 was really a learning year. '94, then had some experience, still relatively young, and Justin Dill was going very well by then. But it was actually Rudy Lancaster who won the championship that year, and Rudy had obviously still doing historics now, but Rudy had done British Championship by then, so he'd actually come back from doing BRC, I think, in a Sierra Cosworth at the time, to doing the Peugeot Challenge, and so he was very experienced and went well. And yeah, we had a mixed run early on, not too bad, but we won again in Flanders, and actually in Le Touquet. I think if Rudy finished outside the top three and we won, then we'd win the championship. And it was a tarmac rally, which by then I was going pretty well on tarmac. Again, we did a good recce. I was actually feeling quite confident going into it. And the first stage was wet, and I set the brakes up in the dry and hadn't just accounted for the fact I might have a bit too much front brakes, and literally locked up at the first junction and lost 4 minutes in a ditch. And we fought back to second, but pushing quite hard, I think, because Justin was leading the rally, and we went off again and we ended up fourth. So yeah, second in the championship that year, which was a shame, but I mean, whether it would have changed anything with hindsight, I'm not really sure. So but just the lasting memory of those events is just how many cars there were out on the rallies. Like I said, when you had 60 cars out in the championship, and I bang on about it regularly on anybody who listens to Absolute Rally. They'll hear me talking about one make championships, but there was nowhere to hide. Like if you were any good, you shone, and if you weren't, you didn't. It was as simple as that. And there was good support from Peugeot. There was a good prize scheme. Obviously, you had to buy the parts from Coventry, so they made good revenue out of it as well. But it worked all around. There was supported drives at the end of it, like I said, prize money, but ultimately they made money as a business as well. So as well as selling more Peugeots out of it. And those championships are very sadly missed, particularly in UK rallying.
Yeah, you just touched on, I was going to raise that point, the decline of the one make championship as a real tour de force in both development and strong competition, because you said there was nowhere to hide. And those championships, like right across Europe, produced serious talent and serious competition, and and were a good business model as well for the brands too. So they are definitely sadly missed. And I don't know, we could debate this for a long time, but it'd be nice to see an effective replacement for those things.
Yeah, it absolutely would, but I think unfortunately it's reflected in the lack of interest in rallying in this country for whatever reason. The manufacturers aren't involved anymore, but again, that's a reflection of where the sport is in this country, because unfortunately BRC doesn't get much coverage anymore. Therefore, what's a manufacturer actually going to get out of it? And I guess even if we look at British touring cars, which gets incredible coverage, huge spectator numbers, but there's still not that much manufacturing money in there. Yes, there's official teams and official support, but most of the drivers are still having to find £500,000 to do a year's racing. So yeah, we really struggle for manufacturer backing in this country, but particularly in rallying. And if you do go to France, you go to Belgium, these one make championships are still there in Spain, in Portugal. You still see Peugeot championships. There's a GI Yaris Cup in Italy and Spain and Portugal now. And like I said, unfortunately, it just reflects the general lack of interest in rallying in this country now.
Did you have an appreciation of just how good the Peugeot Challenge was at the time? Or was it totally, in the passage of time that you sort of began to grasp how well supported, competitive, and etc. it was?
I think a bit of both, because you knew at the time if you wanted to get noticed, then that was the championship to do, because obviously Richard Burns had already come through it, Colin McRae in the early days with the Young Lions. You had the Johnny Milners, the Paul Franklins, the Chris Birkbeck, all Peugeot supported drivers, and of course everybody was aspiring to. It's funny, isn't it? Aspiring to be a works rally driver. Can you imagine that now? How do you aspire to be a works rally driver? I mean, my 205 cost €6,000. It wasn't 86,000 euros or whatever you have to give now for I don't even know, a rally 4-car or whatever they are now. I have no idea. But you're talking an awful lot of money, and that was £6,000 for a 205, which we ended up putting an engine in it. And to be honest, the shell was tired. But it wasn't expensive. Yes, okay. I'm not saying that anybody could do it, because they couldn't. But in comparison to the costs of getting involved now, it was substantially cheaper, and there was prize money. Mm-hmm. It was obvious what the Peugeot were putting money in. That Peugeot was supporting not only young drivers, but they also had a works rally program. There was progression there. And it continued, obviously. I mean, Peugeot did it all the way through. The 306 Championship didn't really get the numbers in quite the same way, but then, of course, the 106s, 206s were incredibly successful as well. They really did, at the time, run the best one-make championship.
I think you're completely right. I mean, and the link to the 306. I mean, that must have been a fun car to drive, the S16. And was that a natural progression for you?
It was a natural progression, because at the end of '94, the 205 production was production I think was already discontinued by then. So obviously Peugeot wanted to move on from the 205 and the 309. And they launched the 306 Championship, which also became the British Junior Championship, which also meant stepping up to the British Rally Championship. So again, there was in '95, there was myself, Justin, Neil Waden. There was a number of good drivers in it. The only issue really that year was the cars were brand new. So we had quite a few development issues, I would say, even through '95 and even into '96. And it wasn't always the fastest car that won, just because there were such new cars in rallying terms. So the 205, by the time I got to it, was so well developed that reliability wasn't really something you ever thought about. Whereas the 306, it did throw a fair few issues, and like I say, some came out better than others with that. But nonetheless, it was still it was a progression. It was almost a natural move, because that took me into the British Championship, and like we said, into starting to make pace notes on every rally, starting to make pace notes on gravel for the first time, and BRC always was a fantastic place to develop. I mean, it had some of the best rallies. I would say some of the best rallies in the world. Going to the Isle of Man, the Manx International at the time was just incredible. Ulster rally that lasted, I can't remember how long it lasted at the time, but you just never stopped. You finished like late on the first evening, then it restarted at whatever 4 a.m, and you were out on the road again, and it was like really, it was just continuous, really. And there were, and of course around the ralley, by then you had the Alistair McRae's, the Mark Higginses, the Gwyndaf Evans, who were all doing the rally as well, and so you sort of suddenly mix in with the people that you aspire to be like, and that was suddenly very different to doing BTRDA rallies, I would say.
How much of a challenge did you find switching to making your own pace notes at that time? Was it a big challenge, and did you then find, presumably, that it was actually a much better way of doing things as well?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think I was lucky in that I'd done the tarmac rallies at the end of, so the 205 Championship tended to ramp up during the year to do the bigger rallies at the end of the year. And because I'd had the experience in France and Belgium of making my own pace notes with a relatively unlimited recce, then it was easier to come to a limited recce on the gravel. At that time, the tarmac rallies weren't limited. But the Ulster Rally recce, you only got 2 days to do it, and you could only physically get around everything 2 or 3 times at the most. You were literally running. It was a full-on recce, the Ulster Rally at the time. It just never ever stopped. The Isle of Man was a bit easier because it wasn't limited in time, so you could spend a bit more time on the Isle of Man, and the Manx at the time we had, quite a good recce and a good amount of time to recce. I remember the first time I went to the Manx, which was 95. By the time we arrived, there was all these stories of people taking number plate light bulbs out of the recce cars and covering number plates up, and accidents on the recce, usually by either French or Belgian drivers who'll remain nameless, but rumours of paying locals off because they'd had a head-on a back road and whatever else. And there was big money around at the time. Of course, you had the manufacturer spending a lot of money there, and towards the end of the 90s, particularly, when the F2 days came along.
The Manx, it really had such a heyday in the early and mid 90s as well. It's one you look back on now and think, you can look back at obviously loads of famous events over the years, but if I had a chance to spectate or take part in a couple of those ones, it's still wow moments watching a lot of the coverage of the Manx. It just looked really, really special.
It was, and it was, it was a hard rally as well. It just, it seemed to go on forever. I remember doing it, I think it was 99, and it was something like, I don't know, I want to say 250 stage miles. Well, a WRC rally never sees 250 stage miles now. And it, they were tough rallies. They just, but the Manx was always just a real challenge anyway, because the nature of it's so fast in places, very fast, very high speed. Of course, you have the wide open roads and the very narrow, bumpy, almost single track roads. If it was wet, it was pretty lethal as well, which found out on several occasions. But it's like you said, I mean, even before I went to the Isle of Man, I'd been spectating with mum and dad. I'd been and watched mum compete there. I remember watching at Brandywell Cottage, Tony Pond and a Rover Vitesse. Can still remember that clearly. It was the year that he drove the white Daily Mirror car before he finished it off on the RAC. But I remember being at Brandywell and he handbraked uphill, and all the crowd were just cheering. So to go to the Isle of Man and compete on those stages was something quite special. Just to even go and do the stages that I'd seen Mikkola, Toivonen, Blomqvist, etc., all competing on those same stages.
Superb stuff. For the following year, you had an Impreza 555. Would that be would that have been your first experience of four-wheel drive rally car?
Yeah, very much so. So at the end of 96, we'd had a tough year with the 306. The second year, we were normally going very well, either leading or certainly in the top three, but had some unreliability with it, and ended up didn't finish the championship in the end just because there was no point. We couldn't really win anything, so it was really what to do for 97. We looked at a couple of different options. I say we because Dad, I couldn't have done it without Dad at the time, and my grandfather even was helping as well. And it was by that time F2 was kicking off, and we actually looked. I remember at an ex kind of a work spec Astra. I don't think it was actually an ex-works car. It was a Tim Ashton built car, which ironically now it's quite topical. It was a Gazprom car. So Gazprom had a quite a strong rally team for a while, and Gazprom had run these sort of work spec Astras, and I remember we looked at that. But the sheer running costs of the things even then, was very expensive, and in comparison, a Group N car was relatively cost effective, and actually that Subaru we ran in 97 was a recce car, and we bought an ex recce car from Pro Drive. It was Kenneth Ericsson's recce car from 1996, and literally, I mean, we put had the engine rebuilt, put a restrictor in it, and that was more or less it. We went and did the British Championship with it. So it was relatively cost effective for what you could achieve with it. The Achilles heel with the Subaru at the time was the gearboxes, and the MSR that were running at the time for me, they became pretty adept at changing a gearbox, and you had to carry a spare gearbox because it just wouldn't last a British Championship rallies, we found out. But other than that, it was a pretty good car, really. And then for 98, we ended up going the Mitsubishi route because of the gearbox, really. There was the Evo 4 was out in fact, even the Evo 5 came out in 98, but we had a chance for quite a good Evo 3, and that's what I ran in 98. And the gearbox was strong. It was just everything else that broke. So we had an engine problem in Wales, we had an electrical problem on the Pirelli. We were going all right in Scotland, then we broke a drive shaft, had a puncture, and then I binned it on the Ulster. So 98 didn't go particularly well.
Weren't you top 20 on the RAC in that Evo 3 as well that year?
We were lying just, I think, round about the top 20, maybe just inside the top 20 the last morning of the 98 RAC, and it was thick fog. And I remember in the area around Walters Arena, not the other side of the hill, it was really thick fog, and just came into a corner and just saw a massive rock that had been pulled out. Like a massive rock, like an embedded piece of stone almost, that had just become, that had just, with the cars passing over it, had come loose, and I just hit it, and it ripped the corner off it. And at the time, that was quite hard to take. Actually, that was my first RAC or Rally GB, as it was at the time, whatever it was called, Network Q Rally, and to not finish and to get a top 20 at that point, particularly after a bad year, would have been quite something. So that was quite tough not to finish that rally. The same event actually where Carlos Sainz didn't finish either. That was the same rally. He got within whatever it was, 200 meters of the finish line. We didn't get quite that close, but it was the last day.
That's the famous helmet through the back window incident, isn't it? Yeah,
the same one. Yeah, I still remember seeing Tommy Mackinnon's Evo 5 on three wheels after Millbrook, because he drove it out the stage and he was trying to drive it down the road, and then the police actually stopped him. And I remember there's a village hall, I don't know, a couple of miles down the road from Millbrook, and I can still picture where he was parked up.
Did we ever ID the owner of that particular Hillman Imp that dumped all the oil on that corner at Millbrook or not?
I'm sure with EWRC now it wouldn't be that difficult actually. The results of the historic rally are probably there somewhere if we had a look.
He's probably petitioned the EWRC to remove him from the website. How would you rate the Evo versus the Impreza in Group N form at the time? Obviously, the troubles of the production 5-speed in the Impreza are well known and still causing people trouble to this day, actually, as I saw at the weekend when we passed an Impreza with its gearbox blown up. But how would you rate the two cars as and the competition?
Well, it was exactly that. That was exactly at the time with the 5-speed gearbox in the Subaru. It was just its Achilles heel, and ProDrive did a couple of different gear kits at the time, and this is the new gear kit. This one's stronger, and you fitted it, and it lasted about the same length of time as the other one. And David Higgins at the time was doing the British Championship with the Barrett's car, which was like it was everything ProDrive could do at the time. They had a proper new build car. I remember they were running sort of turbo fuel, which at the time to us that was like, what? Like, what? You don't just go to the petrol station and buy petrol for it. But even then, they were struggling for gearboxes just the same. And the Mitsubishis were definitely the stronger car. Maybe slightly heavier, maybe not quite as nimble, but they were a stronger car, and the engines on the Mitsubishis were always very, very strong as well. But it really depended on which car. And then, of course, in 99, then they allowed dog boxes, really, because Subaru pushed for it. And once the Subaru got a dog box, then it alleviated that problem. But it really did depend on what version of car and who built it, and the engine mapping was a big thing as well. if you had somebody good doing the engine mapping, it made a massive difference. In fact, funnily enough, the Subaru I ran in 1997 had a ProDrive map in it, but somebody remapped it at the end of the year and said, right, have a go in that now, and it was a different car. But we, unbeknown to us, it was a GEMS ECU, and actually, if you knew what you're doing, you could remap it. But we thought because it was a ProDrive map, it was the best it could be. But far from it with hindsight. And it was the same really through the Group N days. I drove various Group N cars over a period of 10 years, and even in the Evo 9 days, you'd drive 2 Evo 9s, and there was just no comparison between the two, just depending on who'd done the engine, how close to the edge the engine was, and what fuel it was running.
It's fascinating the number of variables that even in modern rallying still, crop up along those lines.
Yeah, it is. And like I said, by then, obviously, turbo fuel was normal, really, particularly at British Championship level. And again, the difference between a pump fuel and a proper turbo fuel, whatever it was at the time, Shell, Elf, whatever. And of course, the car had to be mapped to that. But I remember doing a back-to-back test one day between the two, and just not necessarily the top end, but in the Group N cars, just the mid-range and the torque was the difference was quite noticeable.
Of course, it's much healthier for the engines as well. Probably much less chance of detonation as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Much more consistent, higher oxygen content, better burn. Obviously, at the time, it was higher oxygen content as well, so sort of 1 or 2 as opposed to 98 or whatever you were getting at the pump at the time. So, yeah, it was a big advantage to be running a proper fuel. But of course, I don't know. Even then, it was incredibly expensive compared to pump fuel, and got ever more so. But it wasn't a new thing. I remember a friend of mine was involved with Nissan with the GTIR, like back in 1991, and I remember him talking of fuel at £10 a litre in 1991 because they were just brewing their own fuel effectively, and obviously all the teams were at it, and it just made such a big difference in performance that there's no wonder things eventually became a little bit tighter regulated and control fuels and all that, because the normal additive at the time, like back in the early 90s, was toluene, like whatever it is, paint thinners or whatever it is, I don't know what it is, but I remember if you spilt it on the floor, it would lift paint off a workshop floor within seconds. It wasn't nice stuff, but it was a cheap way to make go faster fuel.
It's also intrinsically associated with the Toivonen incident, isn't it? Toluene, or at least one of the theories that I hear banded around.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, there's a few, isn't there? Nitrous has been mentioned a few times as well, hasn't it? And whatever else, but for some reason the car exploded, obviously, and it wasn't a massive impact, was it? Unfortunately, and obviously quite topical at the minute, been that time of year, and yeah, I mean, that was a huge loss to the sport. And like I said, when you see the actual size of the off, it wasn't a big accident. And very sad loss for the sport.
Totally. Having presumably cut your teeth on turbos and all-wheel drive, the move back to the Peugeot 106 and natural aspiration and front-wheel drive, that must have been, if not a culture shock, certainly a challenge.
The biggest difficulty with that, so in 99 I did some of the BRC, but by then we were sort of struggling for money and struggling for any real forward direction. So 99 was the first year of the 106 Cup. Mark Fisher won it. I was quite good friends with Mark. We met in a bar in Letterkenny at about 4 a.m. on the Donegal rally. And we sort of became friends after that. And anyway, Mark had won it in 99, says, you've got to do this in 2000. So I went to do it. But we just talked about pace notes. I actually struggled going back to organisers' pace notes at the time. And when you got so used to driving on your own personals, and then by then I was against a new breed, so it was then Gary Jennings, Rory Gallagher, young bloke called Chris Meek. There was there was a whole host of quick drivers in the 106s, and it took me a while to just get used to, I would say, taking risks again, because taking risks on your own pace notes is certainly a lot easier than taking risks on organisers' notes. Plus, the rallies were very short, and it did take a bit getting used to. But we had some good runs in 2000. But again, I don't know why, unreliability seems to have struck me a few times over the years. And we bought a used car from 99 for 2000. And we didn't realise at that time how weak the body shells were, because Peugeots aren't really known for their strength, particularly a 106. I mean, it didn't weigh anything anyway. And we had dry shaft problems on a couple of occasions, and it was the chassis legs were flexing. And the car was only like, 18 months old by this time. And there was like flex in the body shell. And anyway, we ended up with a couple of non-finishes that we shouldn't have had. Went back to Flanders that year. So Flanders was the last round of the championship. We couldn't win the championship by then. I think it was second last round of the championship, actually. But so we couldn't win the championship, but I was adamant we were going to win Flanders. And I had Alan Harriman with me, who's since become a good friend. And I was lucky enough to have Terry co-drive on a couple of occasions, funnily enough, on the Manx. And then Alan did Flanders with me that year in 2000. And I had a 106 rally as a road car. And we'd done every stage, I would say, a dozen times. And we had this rally won before we even went over the ramp, except halfway through the first stage we didn't. And it just got out of phase on a bump, and we hit a barn backwards. And this a 106 isn't a long car, but by the time we'd hit the barn, it was a bit shorter, substantially shorter, actually.
That sounds like a proper accident.
Yeah, it was a reasonable accident, but the reason they had to stop the stage was we dug up a World War I mine as we'd gone through the field.
Oh, crikey.
Wow, that's both my interest in the war and rallying together at last.
Yeah. So anyway, it needed reshelling after that. 2001 it did go better. Rory won the championship, but we had some good battles that year. Like I say, between Gary, Chris, Rory, and myself, a few others that were in there as well. That was a good year, just everybody going like idiots in 106s. We did some good rallies. We did some good rallies, and then that was the year of foot and mouth, of course. So the first round was the Rally of the Wirral, or the Rally of 1,000 Corns, as it became known. So yeah, we did a mixture of rallies that year. But good memories of the 106s, because again, it was just back to close competition, really, and everybody was just on it, just absolutely on it.
Yes, again, another example, a lot to be said for one make championships, again, just breeding tighter and tighter battles in the same machinery is always just as exciting to watch as people in different stuff. Yeah,
absolutely. And the 106s weren't massively powerful, but the gearing was pretty good in them, and we still see quite a lot of 106 Cup cars out there now, 206 Cup cars, and like you say, because they were identical, and Peugeot were pretty good at monitoring the championship in terms of scrutineering, so the cars were equal, and there was just some proper battles, because again, like we said before, if you wanted to be at the front, you had nowhere to hide, and by then there was like I said, very little in the cars, and it was good racing, really.
They were presumably quite production-based cars as well. There wasn't much in the way of changes made to those, was there?
No, a little bit. I think maybe they had different cams in them. But the big thing was the gearbox, because they had a lower final drive and a proper diff in them. So they were only geared to like 100 miles an hour. So they accelerated relatively quickly. They were very light. They stopped very well because they still had 4 pots on them. Mm-hmm. So they actually, for a relatively standard car, if you like, they really did carry some speed. Did
quite a long second gear as well, if I recall correctly, don't they?
I don't know.
I think they're a couple of quite
You maybe
long in
recall better than
second.
me, but I remember like fifth gear was you soon ran out of speed in fifth gear. That was for sure. But they were they, like I said, because they were so light and you had good brakes. I mean, and we're on Michelin's as well, which so they were good tires. And I remember on the tarmac they were quite a weapon actually on tarmac for what they were.
The following year, the move to the Puma 1400. I mean, that must have felt like a big deal at the time, presumably because it was.
Yeah, I mean, that came about really through my longtime friend and Mum's longtime friend Chris Birkbeck. So Chris, by then, had been running like a Ford satellite team for quite a long time. From what would it be? I think 96, maybe he was running the RS 2000s, and maybe most well known for running the Simonite Sisters with the auto windscreens car. But Chris had 3 or 4 of the RS 2000s at the time. I did the Jim Clark in 99 in an ex-Gwyndaff Evans car, and Chris and I had always tried to do stuff together, but the one problem was paying for it. And there was normally cars there, but it was the same old story of how do you fund it, and particularly with those F2 cars, because I think even then an X-Track box for RS 2000 was like £25,000 or something in the late 90s. These were expensive cars at the time. And as much as I'd always wanted to try and do something with Chris, it just never really worked out. And Chris said, right, you might as well come and do this 1400 championship. He says, you can win this. And if you win it, there's a Super 1600 car at the end of the year. So that's what I did. Went and did the 1400 Puma Championship. Its Achilles heel was the gearbox. It had a dog box in it, but it wasn't very strong, and you really had to be quite careful with the gearbox. Which I learned that one pretty early on. I think I remember finishing the Rally of Wales with 3 out of its 6 gears, and actually you never used 6th because it was geared to like 150 miles an hour or something. So 6th wasn't the gear you ever used. But that year went pretty well, and we won the championship, and I think we won 12,000 quid in prize money or something like that as well. So that year went to plan. Really, it was go and do it, win it, get the Super 1600 car for the following year.
I must admit, I'd forgotten how much production kit was carried over into the 1400 Puma. The live back axle for one, and the standard, presumably strengthened IB5 gearbox casing as well, which presumably was a factor in the aforementioned gearbox issues.
Yeah, I think that the gears were quite small. The drive shafts came out of, I think, maybe a V6 Mondeo or something like that, and the hubs were, I think it was V6 Mondeo, I could be wrong, but there was some drive shaft issues with them as well. I mean, fundamentally, if it had been lower geared, it would have been quite a good car. It was the gearing, it was just really over geared, but we were limited to what we could run in the championship, and it was on 17-inch wheels on tarmac as well. It was just the gearing was very long on it, but it fundamentally could have been a good car. It just was always a bit short of development, the 1400.
So the 1600 then must have been just really day and night between that car, was it? Or did it feel quite similar to begin with, and then it quickly revealed itself to be a totally different
No, it was
beast?
a totally different car. I mean, obviously the first thing was the transmission, with it being sequential, flat shift, much shorter gearing. No, it was a completely different thing to drive. The thing about the Super 1600 car is you could be doing 25 miles an hour and it still feel like it was ripping your arms out. That car, you always felt like you were going fast regardless of what speed you were doing. But even with the 1600 car, it really didn't have the level of development that a lot of the competition had, because at the time it was this €100,000 price cap that the FIA had introduced, and Boreham developed the car to the €100,000 price cap. Whereas if you went and bought a 206 or a Clio or whatever else it was at the time, you could buy a kit of parts for €100,000. But it's a bit like with the R5 cars now, or the Rally 2 cars. What you want a sump guard? Really? Oh, and what a trip meter, and you actually want a footrest, and really you want a roof vent in it, and so on and so on. And suddenly it's like, for one you can actually rally, it's suddenly 30 or 40 grand dearer. So the same stands today.
That was that an ex-Francois Duval car?
Yeah, it was. Yeah, so it was the car, and
the Monty
yeah,
car.
yeah. It again, that didn't all kind of pan out quite as planned, because we won a championship, and the deal was the loan of a 1600 car for the year, full spares package. In fact, we've got a transit van full of spares from Boreham. Car was prepared from Boreham, and I think at the time the deal was something like £30,000 in cash to run it. And I remember going to Chris and saying, right, what else do we need? And I think it was like another 60 or something even then to do British Championship. I think it was something like a £90,000 budget. And anyway, long story short, Boreham came up with a plan to put me with Rally Sport Ireland, and I ended up getting run by Stan Harper out of Ireland, which that was great. All worked out in terms of funding, because it meant I didn't have to find any more funding. But Chris and I had sort of put the whole plan together to do that year together, and that had been the hope, but it didn't quite work out like that. But ironically, the car was one that Chris had run, like you said, for Francois. He won the 2002 Monty in it. Guy Wilkes then did the 2002 BRC in it, then went back to Boreham for a rebuild, and I was given it for the 2003 BRC.
You had a pretty strong year of results in that car as well. I mean, you must have been pretty happy with it overall.
It was up and down, honestly. What sort of Clive, who's running it at Stan's, who funnily enough I'm still in touch with now, and Stan, and what everybody at Harper's was really struggling with was the amount of different spec of Puma parts there was by then. There was evolutions and evolutions and evolutions, and obviously the car had just been rebuilt from Boreham, so you assumed it had the right spec of everything. But we had a Boreham mechanic coming on each rally going, well, that's the wrong spec, that's the wrong spec, and what are those ramp angles and the diff? No, you don't want them ramp angles, you want this ramp angle, and no, you don't want that final drive, you want this final drive. And so even by then there was like I said, the car had developed, and there was different specs that we weren't always knowledgeable about. And obviously it was difficult because Chris was running rival cars, albeit under the same Ford Junior Team umbrella, but I didn't really think I could go along to Chris and say, what do I need to be using? What do I do with this? What do I do with that? There was some help, but it was a little bit of a frustrating year in that we never really, it took us a while to get it to work on gravel. It was better on tarmac. The car inherently was better when you had traction, because it always struggled for traction. Again, Chris did their own diff spec, and they got it a lot better, but it still inherently had relatively poor traction against, like I say, some of the later, better developed cars. But if you either had flowing gravel or a really flowing tarmac, then on the Manx it was a lovely thing to drive on dry tarmac. On the Manx it was fantastic. It was the first car I ever drove on tarmac where you actually pulled a gear more than you thought you would. We obviously all remember watching the 306 Maxis, the Megans, etc., with the wide track. And I mean, the Puma never had that power, but it did have the track, which meant and relatively lightweight. So actually the speed you could pull through, it wasn't the super high speed corners. It was like the fourth, fifth gear corners where you thought you should actually be lifting, and particularly coming from a heavy Group N car. Whereas in that car, you could, the corner speed was quite eye opening. That was the first car I would say that I drove on tarmac where you could actually carry more corner speed than you thought you could. Like I say, it was a bit of a mixed year, but we certainly set some good times. And the Ulster, I remember the Ulster that year, it was wet, and that was quite a tricky rally for the car, because the muddy, narrow lanes. It started around Armagh that year. Just didn't really suit the car, but I think we ended up second. Chris won Super 1600. We ended up second. We should have won the Manx, and I made a mistake on the last day. That was my own fault. We were leading Super 1600 last day of the Manx and cruising, honestly. And it was dry, and I just simply made a mistake. I think probably the only mistake I remember making in that position, the only unforced error, if you like, where didn't have to do anything. All I had to do was bring the car home. And we've heard a lot of people talk about it over the years that it's not always easy to do that. And that rally still hurts. The 2003 Manx, we were lying 6th overall, 2-minute lead in Super 1600. All I had to do was finish. That one hurts. It still hurts now. But track road that year, we went to the track road and we were going all right. We were sort of mixing times with Gwyndaf in the MG, Chris in the Corsa, which was a better car. But in the end, we had dry shaft problems, and that sort of dropped us right back. But it wasn't the year that I'd hoped. At one point it looked like we would maybe go to JWRC the following year, but then Boreham closed at the end of 2003, and it was great to be involved with a factory back Super 1600 car. It just maybe didn't quite deliver what I hoped it would in terms of longevity. But it was still the right decision to make at the time. It was the right thing to do, and it didn't work out for various reasons. But I think we all know rallying doesn't owe anybody anything, and looking back, it was still nice to do a year in that car, really.
What a car as well. I mean, in terms of an outsized impact it's had on rallying in terms of culture, I can't think of many Super 1600s that have over-delivered more than the Puma.
No, I mean, it was a great looking car. There's no two ways about it. And even now, it still looks fantastic. And I think it's the same with the Megans and the 306s. They're just cars that look right, don't they? And for all the interest around the 2-litre kit cars has obviously been there for a long time. There's a real subculture of interest around Super 1600 cars now, because they were factory developed proper rally cars, and they sounded fantastic. I remember somebody saying that to me on the track road. An local escort guy came up and said, "That sounds better than a BDA in the forest." And they were cool cars. It was a good category. I think the problem was towards the end, it just got so expensive. It was never cheap, because there were effectively, albeit there were these €100,000 cars. I think that was extended maybe to 120 at the end. But if you look at the cars that ended up in that category, the C2 and the Swift, the development was quite impressive by that point. They were proper little rally cars by that point, the end of Super 1600.
It's probably my favorite of the junior categories, as it were, in terms of the classes. It produced some really, really cracking stuff, and I'm an absolute sucker for a C2 Super 1600, as you just mentioned as well. And the Puma, as you both rightly pointed out, it's aged magnificently, probably better than it actually as a road car. Even it's probably come into its own almost in terms of its looks now as well. It really looked a business, but the Puma's kind of coupe design really suited those big arches and the wing and the rear. It just looked really special, particularly in tarmac trim.
Yeah, and like you say, I think even as a standard car, I remember talking to Alan Rose, who ran Boreham at that time, and he said they underestimated the success of the Puma at the time, and they had to stop making it because somebody will correct me on this, but I think he said at the time they'd used soft tooling to produce it, so effectively the tooling wears out. They'd never geared it up to be like a 10-year production run. So literally, they made as much as they could till everything was pretty much worn out. They never expected it to be as successful as it was, because underneath it was a Fiesta. But it just looked so much better and drove so much better. And like you say, as soon as you put the wide arches on it, it was a fantastic looking car. Obviously it spawned the limited edition racing Puma as well, which looked stunning as a road car. But I remember they couldn't sell them. All Ford management were giving them because it was a 20-odd £1,000 car at the time. You could buy an Impreza for, I think, even less at the time. So it was a special car. It was built by Tickford, but it had 150 horsepower, whereas an Impreza had whatever 215, 220, was four-wheel drive, turbocharged, and everything else. So I remember they really struggled to sell the racing version. But again, it just looked, it really did look fantastic.
Yeah, and those racing Puma values just exploded in the last 3 years as well or so. That is for a car that no one really wanted to buy. And when you look at the maths of it, as you say, it does make sense. Why not? I think I read somewhere you could get like a fully pro-drive performance packed, all boxes ticked Impreza at that point for less even than a Fiesta in a fancy frock.
Yeah,
almost as it were, which is quite an injustice to it. But
there was so much work I think went into them though, because they went from Tickford they went to Tickford as a relatively standard car, and then obviously they did this whole body kit. They put all the body kit on, and then they were painted, and the seats and the suspension was, the brakes, the engines. They were quite an expensive car, I think, for Ford to build at the time. And like you said, just the maths of it didn't work. But anyway, thankfully, there's one of them tucked up next door. So
that was kind of my next thing. Yes, you've reacquired the same car then.
Well, yeah, but there's a racing Puma to go with it. So
brilliant, brilliant.
Yeah. So I sourced a racing Puma for a friend of mine a few years back, and he had it for about 4 years, and it sat in a shed for the last 2 years of his time with it, and I bought it in a bit of a sorry state. And it's, again, that's another slow project, but that one will come back to life eventually. So there is a racing Puma there, but I sort of kept track of where the original Super 1600 car was. At the end of 2003, it was sold into Ireland from Boreham. It came back into England about 2008, and it was pretty easy to keep track of because it was in and out of Chris Birkbeck's workshop, which is only 20 minutes away. So I had seen it and sort of knew where it was, and Chris was talking about buying it, and a couple of others were talking about buying it, and we managed to get in and buy the car. So the original car. Chris did kindly give me the FIA Gull logbook that he still had in the top drawer of his filing cabinet for it. So all the paperwork's there to support it. And as we said before, it was the Duval Monte car. So the only Puma ever to win around the World Junior Championship. And I've got, thanks to Colin McMaster, I've got some pictures of the car at the Palace. So there's Prince Albert stood by the car, Max Mosley, Dave Richards, and Francois Duval with the car. So quite nice, quite nice mementos. The only thing I haven't got, which sits in Chris's office, is his original rally plate, but he won't let me have that.
Sure, you'll start working on it.
No, there's no chance. There's no chance. He's not giving me that. He says I'm not having
it. So what kind of work has been going into that particular car then, Ryan? Is there much, what's your overall plan to it? Restore to original factory spec or go a bit more modernized with it? Or
no, not at all. I want to keep it as it was and pretty much put it back to how it was originally. It hadn't really deviated away from its original spec that much, honestly. Like any rally car that's been subsequently rallied for 20 years, she was a bit dog-eared. But the plan wasn't really to do a bare shell rebuild on it or anything like that to make it concourse. I mean, I'll probably do that eventually, but the idea is just really to get it up and running again and get it out, maybe do a couple of demo events with it. So the gearbox has been done on it. The engine's away to be done at the minute. The car's back in the original colours now in the red and blue. It's just at the local sticker company. They're just putting the original Ford Rally Sport livery on it. So yeah, it'll look as it did originally. I mean, I guess eventually it'd be nice to bare shell it and make it very shiny, but I think it'll just be a car I'll hang on to. And as we just mentioned, really, with the interest in Super 1600 and it being a good-looking car, they're relatively rare. There's not so many about, and whilst there was a few cars built, there wasn't so many that had an interesting history, shall we say? So, it's nice to have the one that not only has my history but has that Monty history as well.
Can't wait to see it out.
Hopefully by let's see. I'm not making any promises, but hopefully it'll be up and running somewhere this year.
It's very brave of you to actually pin yourself to a deadline.
I was going to ask, was there a particular event that you had planned for it, but that would be putting you under too much pressure.
Yeah.
As long as he doesn't say the year.
Yeah, that's it. I don't know. We'll see how things pan out. I have an idea in my head, but I'll leave it in my head for now. One thing it is definitely going to do, and it's something I've never done, and we'll maybe talk about it in a bit, but obviously I had the Subaru there for a while, the 555 car, and I always wanted to take it to Rally Legend and never did. To be honest, the cost of taking that car there always scared me, but and there was always, I think it's one of those events that no matter what you turn up in, somebody will always turn up in something better. So I think the Puma has to go there. The Puma with a straight pipe there should be quite good fun. So it's definitely going to Rally Legend. Probably not this year, but it will go there in the future.
Sign me up. I need to. I've been there a few times, and I will be going back. So yeah, that'll be a good one to see. And it might be, well, I haven't seen many Super 1600s at Rally Legends that much, so good to get another bit of variety out to it, and likely you won't have another Puma there to compete against. So
no, like I said, it's something I've always wanted to do, and just the timing of it's never quite worked, and just like I say, the sheer cost of taking something that costs quite a lot to run anyway to San Marino is not a small undertaking, but I think that's a good car to take. So definitely on the bucket list.
Well, folks, we're going to pause it there for this week. Ryan, Jamie, and I did natter on for quite a while. I mean, he's a very interesting chap, and plenty of great stories to share. So we have split this into 2 parts, and we'll release part 2 next week. Thanks for listening, as always. Bye-bye.